Hello, and welcome to Minds That Matter. I'm Eugene Williams, your host. Tim Wise doesn't consider himself to be an expert on race, but he sure has a lot to say. He says that invariably, white Americans don't see what people of color see and experience, and that there's a denial of racism and social justice in America. Please welcome author, essayist, educator, and anti-racist activist, Tim Wise. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Minds That Matter, which is an apropos, kind of title for some of the things that you're talking about these days.
Well, I suppose we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
See how that works.
Well, what I did was I went through and I did just a little bit of background research on you, and so I've got some wonderful photographs of you.
Oh, this is doubtful.
At a very
That's not one. I hope they get better than. Oh, that's
at a
great.
very young age. At a very young age. So this is you with mom and dad.
Yes, it
okay.
is.
And then this is you.
Yes, it is.
With some really interesting hair.
Yeah.
And then this is you here preparing
That is
for
me.
what it is that you do now.
Well, I was singing there. I was singing Jim Croce, as I recall.
So my question...
You can ignore the drug paraphernalia in the back. That was my parents.
Okay. So my question to you is, throughout your formative years, when did you realize that there was something called privilege and that you were actually privileged?
Right about the time I put those pants on and wasn't disciplined for it, I knew there was privilege. I'm teasing, of course. There's a process of
Sure.
discovery of those kinds of concepts. I don't think privilege was in any way, shape, or form one of the first things that I came to understand about race. That was a little bit further down in the process. I mean, I, as a child, even at the time that some of those pictures were taken, was already certainly being exposed to the concept of race and racialization and what that meant. Now, I didn't necessarily have the cognitive skills to put it all together at 5 and 6 years old, but I had been in preschool at a historically black college. My earliest childhood experiences were really in a black social context. Those were my peers. Those were the women that ran the program. The preschool program at TSU were mostly black women. So I was certainly gaining a sense of the meaning at some level of race, what it meant to not always be the norm, because I wasn't the norm in that situation. I was the abnorm. I was sort of the one that was the fish out of water. And so I think that gave me a certain cornerstone understanding of what it means to be white and what it means to be a person of color who normally is the one who is in the minority, who normally is the one who's out of place.
What were those feelings like, that feeling of difference, being kind of the only one, a minority in
Right.
a different type of
Well,
minority?
at 3, you don't really think a lot about it. I mean, at 3 and 4 years old, it doesn't have much
Yeah.
of an impact on you. What it does, however, is it imprints in you a sense of connectivity to others that other white folks in 1972 is what I'm talking about, might not have had. And the reason that's important is that 23 years later, when I was doing community work in public housing projects in New Orleans, and I'm working with black women who were sort of telling me what's up when it comes to their lives and what's going on in their communities. Because of that early imprinting where I was learning to respect black authority, right, as a kid, as teachers, I'm not gonna be in that moment, I'm not gonna be the white guy that looks at these black women and says, are you sure you're not crazy?
Yeah.
Right? Are you sure you're not seeing things? Maybe I know your reality better than you do, because I think that's something that, frankly, we do a lot in this country. White folks ignore when or we just don't believe when people of color talk about the things they face.
Yeah.
And I had luckily been conditioned to have a different response. So I think that awareness was there. Privilege came much, much later. That was after I'd gone through college. That was, watching the way in which even my activism as a college student doing anti-apartheid work in the 1980s at Tulane University in New Orleans was protected by campus police, even at a time that New Orleans police were literally murdering a black man by the name of Adolph Archie, who they perceived to have killed one of their own. And seeing the contrast between the way that police were treating average, everyday black folks in the city of New Orleans and the way law enforcement was treating really relatively quite advantaged and privileged, mostly white students at Tulane, is where that sort of dynamic came into focus for me, I think, for the first time.
Well, it sounds like you were pretty insightful, even at an early age, though.
Oh, I was very bright, yes.
Yeah.
I was horribly advanced for my age.